Without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jake Burchard, who will be moderating our first panel. Jake is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Chicago. His research is in the areas of economic and political sociology and social network analysis. His dissertation in progress analyzes the changing attitudes of financial sector employees and homeowners in the US and UK in the past several decades. Again, thank you all for being here. I'm sure this will be a great event. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Like Eduardo said, I'm Jake. I'm moderating this first panel, which is called Environment, Governance, and Temporality. And I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists. They'll each have around 20 minutes to give a presentation, and then at the end, they'll all sit here and we'll have a 30-minute Q&A. So our first panelist is Ashima Mittal. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. She works on the interconnections between imperialism and techno-capitalist projects of fixing air pollution in India. She will deliver a paper titled Atmospheric Imperialism and the Reification of Nature. Then we'll have a presentation by Paul Forrester, who's finishing his fourth year in the philosophy PhD program at Yale. He specializes in ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of social science. His dissertation defends novel views about the nature of well-being, the norm structuring market institutions, and natural resource governance. His paper is titled ESG and Asset Manager Capitalism. And finally, we'll have a presentation by Hannah Gadbois, who is currently a PhD candidate in the art history program at UIC. She researches modern photomontage in the Soviet Union and Germany, particularly as it relates to ideas of progress and history. She will be delivering a paper titled Going Nowhere at Top Speed, Feudal and Capitalist Temporalities. So, yeah, without further ado, Ashima, would you like to step up?
There is the PPT. There is the PowerPoint presentation. The PowerPoint presentation. Yes, yes.
I thought you said no. I'm sorry.
Right.
Let me step in
Okay.
for a second. Just go. And you are. Thank you. Yeah, right.
Right, just like.
Yep, that should work. Just let's give it a try.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I want to begin with thanking the conference organizers for this opportunity. The work that I will be presenting today is a part of a larger dissertation chapter where I examine the imperialist formations of technoscientific capitalism as they manifest in the air pollution crisis of India. This work is based on 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork and archival research. I will start this talk with conceptualizing what I call atmospheric imperialism and its relationship to contemporary capital. I will argue that atmospheric imperialism, through its abstract conceptual activity, particularly the incessant theorization of capital's future in a precarious environment through green finance, fundamentally refashions the category of nature. In doing so, I will show how atmospheric imperialism creates new markets and mechanisms of surplus extraction. In February of 2023, I attended the World Sustainability Summit held in New Delhi in the midst of an extreme air pollution event. Just as sulfury air enveloped the conference venue, Bhupendra Yadav, Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change of India, said, and I quote, India is emerging as an inspiration for countries across the globe, particularly on the fact that economic development and conservation of environment can go hand in hand. He overlooked a crowd of industrialists, scientists, financiers, and delegates from across the globe as they rushed to find refuge in the air-purified and air-conditioned conference halls of the Indian Habitat Center. In an array of sessions like Financing India's Net Zero Ambitions, India and the Future of Energy, the Role of Carbon Markets in India, representatives from the World Bank, Amazon, Tata Industries, Rockefeller, and Bloomberg Philanthropies spoke about the possibilities that the air pollution crisis unfolds for a new kind of multilateral world, with India holding the presidency of the G20 summit. Crucially, in these discussions, the Indian atmosphere is categorized as a shock absorber and a shock wrecker for the global system. At the conference, the Indian atmosphere congealed the possibilities of offset markets for global capital, with the rising middle class envisioned as a potential consumer base for the excesses of capitalist production, and India's status as the new manufacturing hub for the world through its surplus population was reaffirmed. At the same time, the demographic excess of India, 17% of the world population, a figure that was repeated multiple times, represented an incalculable threat. It meant more emissions in the atmospheric sink, which already stood at a 3.6 trillion metric tons of CO2 in 2021. Take what break? Trepidation accompanied enthusiasm. We are now under the world of new market mechanisms of the Paris Agreement, said R.R. Rashmi, an ex-Indian IAS officer and a climate policy fellow, expressing concern over the future of green financial markets in India. The new market mechanisms here signify the fundamental moments that redefine the global relations of atmospheric dependency. Starting with the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which lays out unified financial rules to promote a world market in carbon offsets, usually in the global south, and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which embraces most of global capitalist finance and systematizes the precondition that developing countries fully open their markets in order to become eligible for carbon mitigation financing. In addition to this, even the 100 billion promised by the developed capitalist countries to be directed towards Global South for climate finance under the Loss and Damage Fund is also subject to be leveraged by monopoly finance. Almost a century ago, the imminent tendencies of capitalist fusion and fission were defined by Lenin as imperialism, the 20th century stage of capitalist production, a period where finance started dominating the global metabolism of the capitalist mode of production. He argued that capital in the stage of imperialism is centralized in ever-increasing concentrated blocks through intermediation of banks, insurance companies, and stock exchange that are constantly subsuming and destroying smaller branches of capitalists and constantly repartitioning the economic territories of the world. To the extent that monopolies develop, they result from this unprecedented coalescence of industrial and financial capital, giving rise to financial oligarchies. However, unlike the atmospheric imperialism of today, this form of imperialism operated exclusively through the aegis of the nation state and expressed itself in inter-imperialist rivalries. In the 20th century, the political context and form of imperialism have radically transformed. International finance capital proceeds from the division of the world to the division of the planet itself. Intense ecological precarity, scarcity of resources, and a strife for excess within and through these conditions drive imperialist interests that are increasingly cloaked in metaphors of third world development, climate resilience, and green growth. Paralleling the process of concentration is the decentralization of forces of production through the brokerage economies of global supply chains that use and create reserve armies of labor in the global South. The analogy of India as a shock absorber for the global green financial market implicitly confirms this reliance. Mechanisms of income deflation enabled by the enforcement of neoliberal policies in the periphery and the national government's fiscal concession to global capital to entice to locate production processes on domestic soil further ensure that imperial relation of domination is affirmed. Indeed, the revolutionizing force of capitalism has made contemporary theorists declare imperialism's premature death in favor of a deterritorialized empire. It has even prompted thinkers to proclaim a reversal of historical drainage of wealth from east to west and has created optical illusions of radical dissociation between finance and industrial capital in the form of techno-feudalist enterprises. Instead of looking at finance as a self-acting automaton that subsumes everything under its path without a determinate fallout or negation, in the next section, I will focus on green finance as a process through which stability of the capitalist mode of production is seemingly ensured in the midst of ecological dread that works within the grammar of imperialism. Green finance here, as a life support system of capital, is formalized through thousands of reports, analyses, projections that are produced routinely through think tanks and consultancy firms as epistemological conditions of possibility for the capitalist mode of production. Between 2022 to 2023 alone, 18,000 studies were published on green finance in India. During my ethnographic fieldwork, when I asked climate consultants about the need for this overwhelming information machinery of reports, case studies, and simulations, the response I received was telling, and I quote, "Green finance is as much about confusion as it is about certainty. You need to go through all reports that come out, follow the trails, and piece together the story. There are so many moving parts one has to take into account when guiding a company or a firm on how to leverage green finance." From this ethnographic moment, the question arises, what function did the careful orchestration of confusion meant for the system that at once was so unilaterally consumed with producing infographics of certitude? At once, it was clear from this statement that the modes of intelligibility of green finance attempt to mediate a totality, all the factors involved in production. And even beyond functionality, it appears that there is an inherent irrationality to the framework that could not belie even those who had expertise in the field. To exemplify this abstract conceptual activity of capital, I will zoom in on two reports that have been cited multiple times by my interlocutors and all international organizations that were important within this field. These reports are, first, Accelerating Green Finance in India, Definitions and Beyond, and the second is Landscape of Green Finance in India, 2019-2020, published by the Climate Policy Initiative, an advisory organization for climate finance in India. The CPI report begins with making a case for a formal definition of green finance. It states, and I quote, "A formal definition would accelerate the development of financial products and services for investors and depositors, enabling financial intermediaries to assess their climate change risk, and that these benefits would have immediate effect on accelerating green finance." I want to draw attention to the word immediate here. The immediacy of the relation between a formal definitional framework that you can see on the slide and presupposes the logic that formal innovation alone can beget surplus value. The report sees formal harmonization as a way for capital to mediate a future for itself to ensure its immortality and indefinite survival by extending its atmospheric reach into the markets of India, and to institute a recategorization of capital's excessive revenue as green. As a form of fictitious capital, it creates dependencies between international streams of capital and national economic flows in India. For example, the CPI report explicitly conveys that a complete alignment between formal definition of green finance in India and globalized efforts from UNEP and UNFCCC are the indisputable first step in ensuring capital and India's vital future. From the operational typology that we see next on the slide, it shows that this framework focuses on relocation of money capital to and from activities, corporations, sectors, and countries, such that rate of profits can be equalized, turnover times reduced, and a general decentralization of wealth outputs can be secured to support an overall centralization of capital. In other words, the abstract conceptual activity allows an even greater unification of banking, commercial, and industrial capital such that collective class interests can be enacted through the use of green financial instruments. This becomes explicit in CPI's discussion of long-term investors like global insurance companies and pension funds. Since these creditors have a long liability duration for most of their investments, the horizon of climate change poses a greater risk to them than short-term investors. One of my interlocutors, a green finance consultant, explicated this vulnerability in terms of increased payouts and liabilities in the wake of increase in environmental catastrophes like heat waves and floods. In other words, the temporality of climate change matches the risk profiles of long-term investors who are now seen as most vulnerable. And we will see shortly also the ones who stand to gain most from it. Thus, mobilization of private capital for sustainable development is a mobilization of private capital itself in the face of a perceived ecological limit. It purports the fantasy stability can be imposed upon an otherwise anarchistic and uncoordinated capitalism through proper organization and management of the credit system. New laws of capital are being written in this wake. And I would say the foundational law that holds this edifice is, and I quote, "Economies are embedded in nature and depend profoundly on the goods and services nature generates." Taken from the World Bank report, The Economic Case of Nature, this statement congeals the new logic of integrating nature and economy such that global Earth economy pictures can be simulated for near future scenarios. The depth of the future here is till 2050, to be specific. Nature is reified in the form of ecosystem services. As you can see on the slide, 4 categories of such services are typologized. First, provisioning services, which include food, fresh water, wood and fiber, and fuel. Second, regulating services. Third, cultural. And fourth, supporting services. First laid out in the Millennium Assessment Report, called forth by then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2000, the ecosystem services framework was specifically designed for the business community to establish the techno-scientific ground specifically derived from applied Earth system science and modeling scenarios for actions needed to enhance the financial potential of ecosystems and their services. As you can see from the slide, the idea is to not only argue that economies are embedded in nature, but to categorize nature in a way that new aspects of nature can become commodifiable. This process requires a division of nature, as nature is reified from being a social relation between humans and natural history to commodifiable entities and processes, such that qualitatively distinct natural processes could come to stand in for ecosystem services that can be priced in terms of capitalist commodity relations. For example, first an ecological relation, say air purification, is assigned an ecosystem services. Within this framework, air purification would be categorized as a regulating ecosystem service. And a speculative exchange value is calculated associated with this designated service. Plans for assigning property and managerial rights are established to connect service providers with beneficiaries, such that a process of revenue generation, market exchange, and accumulation can be set in motion. Global Earth economy pictures are simulated in potential scenarios of interaction between nature's services and changes in global economy. For instance, the World Bank report of 2021 uses an integrated ecosystem economy model called Global Trade Analysis Project. It is a type of computational general equilibrium model which integrates abstract modeling techniques with empirical economic data to solve questions of supply, demand, and price. Versions of these models are used routinely by climate consultants, corporations, even academics, to understand different future scenarios of the role of nature in capitalist economy. In the World Bank report, GTAB is used to estimate how an economy would react to potential changes in technology, industry, demography, climatic conditions, and land use patterns. As you can see on the slide, this is a very sophisticated model with a 4-part structure, and each part takes into account a unique aspect of nature. Since actual markets for ecosystem services do not exist, these prices are simulated by drawing comparisons with consumer willingness to pay for similar services. For example, returning to the question of air purification. The cost of air purification as a regulating service would be ascertained by posing questions to consumers about how much money they're willing to pay, say, for an air purifier. This is where the scandal of real abstraction at work is revealed most poignantly. The model begins with the presupposition that economies are the intrinsic being of nature. If we recall, economies are embedded in nature. This functions as a formal transcendental a priori by its very nature. It is independent of all positive content. It is a kind of truth, which is its own proof. Economies are embedded in nature. But this is also a truth, as we see from the modeling technique, whose center of meaning lies in an imaginary elsewhere. Going back to the World Bank report, GTAB concludes that a conservative estimate of $2.7 trillion loss in the global GDP can result if ecosystem services are lost or damaged. The unexpected twist in the tale is that this catastrophic damage can be ultimately defeated through adoption of nature-smart policies, policies built through the suggestions of the GTAP model. In fact, the integrated modeling exercise predicts that nature-smart policies will increase the global GDP between 150 billion to 50 billion by 2030, if commodification ensues, obviously. This formal mathematical house of cards functions as the foundation and supplier of content to the law of capital, that economies are embedded in nature. To conclude, I will return to the concept of reification. Lukács argues that reified mind sees the commodity form, the form of exchange value, as its authentic relation to immediacy. It does not even attempt to transcend it. On the contrary, this immediacy is given a scientific grounding through research and expert commentary. In a similar vein, this process of atmospheric imperialism is predicated on the phantom objectivity of these modeled scenarios that make ecological relations appear as though they are immediate relations between two independent objects, nature and economy, but conceal the internal inconsistencies and geopolitical dynamics embedded in them. Thank you.
slides. Can I move this computer though? Can I move the computer like to the desk so I can? Okay, I'll just try to put this right here. No, I don't. I'm just gonna read off of this. Sure.
Is the display working, Helen? Is the display working correctly? Excellent. All right.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks to the organizers for putting together this conference. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the role that asset managers play in the economy and society today. Many of you will no doubt have read Brett's excellent recent book on this topic, Our Lives and Their Portfolios. Brett's focus in that book is on real assets, multifamily housing, hospitals, toll roads, water systems, and other physical infrastructure. I largely agree with Brett's analysis of these real assets, so I'll focus most of my discussion here on the management of financial assets instead. Though I'll try to say something about real assets, particularly land, at the end of my talk. My focus will be on the multi-trillion-dollar managers of financial assets based in the United States, primarily Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and Fidelity. I'll start by discussing the history of these institutions and the fundamental economic driver of their growth, the passive investing revolution, inaugurated by the development of the index fund in the mid-1970s. I'll argue that these institutions have a kind of regulatory power over publicly traded companies, and will show that this power should be, but is not, democratically legitimate. So the talk is in 3 sections. First section, index funds and the rise of asset managers. The index fund is the most important financial innovation since the joint stock corporation itself. An index fund is a type of mutual fund that simply buys every company on the stock market in proportion to its market capitalization. Passive index funds outperform all other active investment strategies simply because, first, it is very hard to beat the market, especially after the fees for active management are taken into account. And 2, because index funds achieve the maximal degree of diversification, and diversification mitigates risk without compromising returns. Much of the academic research that discovered the benefits of diversification in the 1950s and 1960s was done right here at the University of Chicago by such luminaries as Harry Markowitz and Eugene Fama. Yet the index fund as an actual financial product rather than an academic exercise did not come on the scene until Jack Bogle founded Vanguard to provide these products in the mid-1970s. The share of all stock market assets in index funds has consistently grown since then. One recent estimate suggests that around 1/3 of equity assets are passively managed, a share that is expected to continue to grow in coming decades. The rise of the index fund is the fundamental economic driver of the rise of the large asset managers since 1980. There are large economies of scale in providing index funds, since all you need to do is simply buy and hold the entire stock market. Despite their huge importance, the systematic effects of the wide adoption of index funds are not yet well understood. First, note that it's impossible for the portion of capital managed in a passive way to reach 100%. This is the so-called Grossman-Stiglitz paradox. So if this were the case, there would be no active investors buying and selling securities, and hence no changes in the market price of securities. Capital allocation would be done not by a decentralized market with prices, but would rather be done by asset managers who would serve as central planners. No one knows exactly how big the index share can get before the market would cease to be an efficient allocator of capital. And today we have something of a mixed economy in which most capital is allocated by market mechanisms, but some capital is allocated by the centralized planners who manage the index funds. And I'll elaborate on what I mean by this shortly. Second, the incentives of index fund investors are significantly different from investors with concentrated ownership positions in particular companies. Index funds are universal owners. They own every company that exists in proportion to its size. Universal owners want to maximize the level of the profits in the entire economy because they own all the firms in the entire economy. As such, universal owners do not want firms to compete with each other if this competition reduces the level of profits of any of the publicly traded companies. And by contrast, concentrated owners want to maximize the profits made by the firms that they own, but they don't care about industry or economy-wide profits. Both simply want to maximize their profits, but they do so in different ways due to the different nature of their holdings. For precisely this reason, universal ownership has raised significant antitrust concerns among economists and legal scholars. Empirical research has found anti-competitive effects in the product prices in the banking and airline industries that reflect the concentrated ownership by large asset managers. Universal ownership has led to higher prices and lower output in these industries, imposing costs on consumers. Theory also predicts that the share of economic surplus that laborers will receive will decrease because of universal ownership, since labor and capital contract in a market where capital is concentrated and thus has an advantage. Benjamin Braun, in a 2021 paper, points out that the logic of asset manager capitalism should be, quote, should be expected to push the economy towards the lowest sustainable labor share of GDP, end quote. Indeed, labor share of GDP has been in a secular decline during precisely the same period that universal ownership has risen, since the mid to late 1970s. Here too, a growing body of empirical research is beginning to uncover a causal link between universal ownership and the level of real wages. One study estimates that about a quarter of the secular decline in the labor share is due to universal ownership. Asset managers may view this research program as a threat, evinced by the fact that BlackRock released a strongly worded white paper a few years ago, attempting to debunk some of the research findings in this literature. Here's the point stated a bit more abstractly. So there's three claimants on the surplus that's generated by all economic activity: labor, capital, and consumers. The first two claimants produce everything that gets produced, and the third claimant consumes everything that gets produced. Universal owners, qua universal owners, have as their ultimate goal to maximize the return on their investments. Their interests are perfectly aligned with the interest of capital by definition, since they always receive the average return on capital. Universal owners can maximize their returns by maximizing the size of the economy and by maximizing the share of the economic surplus that they receive and minimizing the share that consumers and labor receive. Universal owners cooperate with consumers and labor to create a larger economic surplus, but compete over the distribution of that surplus. And this reveals, I think, a new way of looking at what index funds are. Index funds are a capital union. When capital is held by concentrated owners, different segments of capital have some common interests and some competing interests. So the owners of both Lowe's and Home Depot, for instance, want people to live in larger homes that need more repairs. But the owners have competing interests in capturing more of this market themselves. Universal ownership reconciles this competing interest of different segments of capital, allowing segments of capital to attend only to their shared interests and reconciling their competing interests. In just the same way that a labor union aims to reconcile the competing interests of different laborers in order to allow them to focus on their common interest in capturing more of the social product that would otherwise go to capital and consumers, index funds, the capital union, reconciles the competing interests of different segments of capital in order to allow them to focus on their common interest in capturing more of the social product that would otherwise go to labor and consumers. The question of whether we should allow index funds to continue to grow as they have been for the last 4 or 5 decades is the question of whether we should permit capital to continue to unionize. Before we proceed, we should acknowledge one silver lining, I think, of universal ownership. Universal owners have an incentive to mitigate risks facing the economy as a whole because they are risks to aggregate profits. Universal owners are incentivized to ensure that there's a stable business and regulatory environment in which all firms can operate. Most importantly, universal owners are incentivized to mitigate systemic risks to the economy, such as climate change and war. But universal owners are not sensitive to idiosyncratic risks, insofar as one firm's idiosyncratic risk is another firm's opportunity. Concentrated owners have the opposite set of incentives. Negative externalities produced by one firm are irrelevant from the perspective of a concentrated owner, but universal owners internalize this externality, the externality that's caused when one firm does something to adversely affect other firms. And this is the primary reason, I think, why large asset managers have become interested in institutionalizing ESG requirements in their portfolio companies. Promoting these standards in the companies that they own is consistent with, indeed, it's required by the fiduciary obligations that asset managers owe their clients. And this is because the clients are universal owners. Climate change and environmental degradation, the adverse effects of business and social institutions on social capital, and poor corporate governance are among the most important threats to sustainable profitability in the economy as a whole. The fact that asset managers represent universal owners, along with the fact that those owners usually have a long time horizon, as we heard about in the last talk, explains why asset managers focus most on these issues. So now moving on to section 2, I'm going to give a normative critique of this arrangement. So I've just described an important change in the structure of capital that's been going on since neoliberalism began in the late 1970s. Now I'll discuss how this change has been institutionalized. So 4 large firms that I mentioned at the outset of the talk control about 25% of the voting rights of the typical American publicly traded company and manage some $25 trillion in assets. These managers, because of the large amount of voting rights they control, have power over nearly every publicly traded company. So there's 2 ways to see that asset managers exercise power over publicly traded companies. There's 2 mechanisms by which they exercise this influence. First, they can vote against executives at the shareholder meeting that occurs every year. This doesn't really happen that often because of the second mechanism. Asset managers frequently engage with companies by privately communicating with executives. Engage here is a term they use in the literature that they share with their own clients. The requests or demands that asset managers make in these engagements are not binding, but they have force because they exist in the shadow of the voting rights that the asset managers can exercise at the shareholder meeting. Information about these engagements are not publicly available or accessible to scholars of corporate governance. So we have no way of measuring the influence of asset managers precisely. All we know, and this is something Brett comments on in the recent book, investigating asset managers is sometimes like investigative work because of the opacity that exists in this industry. All we know, all we know is what's in the annual reports that the asset managers give to their clients. And this documents thousands of engagements that occur with pretty much every company each year, but not the content of what is said in those meetings. So my central claim here is that asset managers should be thought of as exercising quasi-political power because they have the ability to regulate all publicly traded companies. And some legal scholars have been recently encouraging us to look at the power of asset managers in this way. So here's a quote from legal scholar Dorothy Wund. Quote, like the EPA and the SEC, asset managers adopt broad standards governing firm conduct, make judgments about compliance, and then bring enforcement actions using their voting power. But unlike those agencies, the scope of their rules is potentially unlimited. Asset managers can adopt rules involving any subject matter and that target any firms in an industry. Not only that, there are no procedural hurdles for the creation of the rules, nor is there any opportunity for judicial review. In other words, the big threes, that is the asset managers' regulatory power, exceeds that of the typical government agency, despite a near total lack of oversight, end quote. The first reason I think that we should conceive of asset managers as regulators can be seen by way of analogy. So here's a couple of examples. On the same day in 2021, both Exxon and Shell were forced to take meaningful actions to reduce their carbon footprint by reducing their investment in new oil and gas infrastructure. In Europe, a Dutch court forced Shell to do this, but in the United States, BlackRock forced Exxon to do this by a vote against Exxon's executives at the shareholder meeting. I think the same thing happened here in both cases. Climate regulation was made and enforced, but only in Europe did the state do the regulating. We can see the same thing in diversity requirements. Beginning in 2005, Norway legally required that 40% of the directors of corporations be women, and the EU will soon follow suit with a similar policy. In the USA, there are also similar requirements, but ones pushed not by government regulators, but by centralized private gatekeepers in the capital markets. It's clear that the same thing here is being brought about by different institutional arrangements. Corporations are being constrained in order to promote environmental and social goals. In the one case, corporate decisions are shaped by asset managers. In the other case, they're shaped in the traditional way by state regulatory agencies. In both cases, the behavior of companies is constrained by regulation. I cannot see a difference analytically between the case where the government forbids firms from offering shares to the public unless they comply with condition X, and the situation in which powerful institutionalized gatekeepers for the capital markets forbid firms from offering shares to the public unless they comply with condition X. In both cases, the rules of the game for participating in the capital markets require complying with condition X. Indeed, I think there's also some reason to think that asset managers possess not just regulatory, but also fiscal powers. They can't levy taxes and distribute revenue in quite the way that the state does, but they can raise the cost of pursuing disfavored activities for all players in the capital market, and they can subsidize the cost of pursuing favored activities. If asset managers can systematically influence the cost of capital for firms across the entire economy, and I think there's some reason to think that they can, then we should think of them as doing something like central planning. So there's two fundamental problems, I think, with this institutional arrangement. First, regardless of whether we like some of the things that asset managers use their power to do, like promoting green investment and diversity, we should be skeptical of loci of power in the marketplace that are not under democratic control. Second, the actions of asset managers are not well aligned with the public interest, as I argued a moment earlier. Asset managers do a good job of acting to advocate for the interests of their clients who are universal owners. But given the fact of pronounced wealth inequality, the interests of capital significantly diverge from the public interest, though they may not in something like the ideal of a property-owning democracy where wealth is distributed much more equally. So finally, the third section, I'm going to talk a little bit about real assets now. One of the main lessons from Piketty's book, Capital, is that there's a striking regularity in how capital is organized. Half of the capital stock of advanced nations in recent times is constituted by financial assets, and half is constituted by real assets, most importantly, real estate. Real estate is made up of land and the buildings that sit on the land. And since buildings gradually depreciate with use and exposure to the elements, it's land that drives the financial return of real assets. Thus, I want to deliver a few concluding remarks on the status of land under asset manager capitalism. My perspective on land, which I develop at greater length in another dissertation chapter, is highly informed by the idea of a land value tax, especially as articulated by Henry George. Taxing land value has good consequences, according to this tradition, because it does not distort economic activity. Taxing land does not make land disappear, though taxing labor makes people work less, and taxing consumption makes people consume less. There's a deontological argument for land value taxation too. Individuals who own land are in no way responsible for the value of their land. Rather, land value is created by the entire community. Hence, if individuals are entitled to the value that they produce, then no individual is entitled to the value of land. The first thing to note about land today is that land value is extremely spatially concentrated. The overwhelming majority of the $20 trillion or so in land value in the United States exists in just a handful of metropolitan areas. If we're entering a period of Neo-Feudalism, it will be unlike the earlier agrarian feudal period, largely to this extent. Piketty painstakingly documents how the value of urban land surpassed the value of agricultural land in the 19th century in all of the advanced economies. And George himself was an urbanite who agitated for land reform in New York City and San Francisco, unlike the prior agrarian reformers who advocated for a land tax like Thomas Paine or the physiocrats. The main point I wish to make in conclusion here is that the George's perspective on land can help us understand and possibly resist the transition back to feudalism. To my mind, George's most enduring contribution is the tight conceptual connection he saw between private ownership of land and the various forms of human subjugation, including slavery and serfdom. George documents the myriad ways in which individuals who own land are subject to domination by those who do. Sorry, individuals who do not own land are subject to domination by those who do. Because everyone must use land both in production and consumption. People continue to move to and live in the cities with high land value because this is where the economic activities and valuable amenities are. People make higher salaries in these cities because they are more productive, but a large portion of the extra value an urban resident produces is appropriated by the owners of urban land. So in the most productive cities, we already have a system where there are a large base of both white and blue collar workers who work largely for the benefit of the people who own the urban land in the city. In his discussion of these matters, George states that, quote, "It is the ownership of the soil that everywhere gives the ownership of the men who live upon it," end quote. Given that the soil on which most of us now live is in cities rather than in the countryside, the neo-feudal manner will no doubt be an urban one, as asset managers continue to assemble large portfolios of rental housing, including multifamily apartments, including manufactured home communities, including even single-family houses. And the reason they're doing this, I think, is the same fundamental driver of the passive revolution that I started this paper by describing. It's the need to diversify large investment portfolios. And given that the returns on real assets are in many ways uncorrelated with the returns of financial assets, there's a huge incentive for insurance companies, pension schemes, sovereign wealth funds, and even wealthy individuals to own large portions of the valuable urban land. So the only way to prevent this, I think, will require a steep tax on urban land of the kind that George advocated. And this will transfer urban land rents from the rentiers to the asset managers that represent them, and will return this value to the urban residents who created it in the first place. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. As said earlier, my name is Hannah Gadbois, and I'm a PhD candidate at UIC in art history. As was also mentioned earlier, my paper is on feudal and capitalist kind of experiences of temporality. So, as anyone who has lost hours on social media can attest, the temporal experience of the internet is one of an unnaturally extended present. The instantaneous feed provides us with an endless loop of content, exercised from its geographic or historic specificity and offered up to us as part of the long present of the scroll. Contemporary cultural criticism backs up this impression. Historians Anne Fuchs, Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, David Harvey, and others characterize the current experience of time as both an overwhelming sense of acceleration and simultaneous stasis. Most significantly, these scholars identify a corresponding loss of the narratives of history. The past that flood our feeds are fragmented and cannot be fit into any meaningful chronology. And troublingly, we're all increasingly hopeless about any direction for our future, thanks to the ecological, economic, and political crises of capitalism. To put it another way, we're going nowhere at top speed. This conception of our historical moment shares a key similarity with the feudal model of temporality. The feudal relationship to time is characterized by an idea of the past and future as indistinguishable, all part of a long present. While this feeling of feudal futurelessness aligns closely with our contemporary experience of temporality, the feeling of acceleration that it characterizes our current moment is very much aligned with the modern conception. With the rise of modernity, static historical time was replaced by a model of progressive acceleration. This acceleration of time grew out of a concatenation of the mass diffusion of pocket watches, a heightened tempo of life, the nervous stimulation of the city, the increased equation of time with money, and new scientific conceptions of time as irreversibly linear. This paper examines our contemporary temporal experience and analyzes its affinities with capitalist acceleration and feudal stasis, respectively, focusing on their roots in economic value systems and conceptions of historic time. So perhaps the most defining aspect of temporality in the modern era was the inculcation of time thrift. This is the process by which workers are made to internalize the idea that time is equal to money, and subsequently, their working time does not belong to them. This is very much in opposition to the feudal era, in which there was really no tension between labor and passing time. Social intercourse and idling were readily intermixed with bouts of intense labor. What's more, labor existed on a cyclical timescale, fluctuating with time of year, time of day, holidays, fairs, and different types of work. Leisure and work were knitted together, meaning that there could be no logical divide between the time of work and the time of personal life. Historian E.P. Thompson describes this feudal mode of work as task orientation, work based on natural rhythms and observed necessities. This style of labor is innately comprehensible, as it requires no abstraction to see the use, indispensability, and outcome of the work. Measured, regular timekeeping did not immediately produce an opposition between work and life. While mechanical clocks were introduced as early as the 13th century, they were generally used to keep time in large towns or in churches, and were not distributed amongst the masses. Even then, the clocks were imprecise and not suited for any sort of rigorous time management. It would not be until the 17th century that clocks would be able to indicate time to the second, and it was not until the very end of the 18th century, and of course the rise of the Industrial Revolution, that timepieces were recognized as a convenience instead of a luxury. It was with this turn to the Industrial Revolution that Western society largely switched from a task-based to a time-based model of work. The process of teaching the workers time thrift after a long history of task-based labor was a deeply difficult process that happened at a variety of different rates. Working hours in a task-oriented system are often as long and as difficult as any factory work, but they are interspersed with leisure time, periods of waiting, and social interaction. Furthermore, the worker feels the necessity and logic of their workday. It is an inevitability that the cow needs to be milked, that the fields need to be reaped and sown. In industrial labor, the work is increasingly abstracted from the product. Instead of doing work based on observed need, workers are following an imposed order. It is this external imposition and its seemingly arbitrary temporal requirements to which workers need to adjust. The Soviet Union serves as a particularly interesting case study for this problem of transitioning from a task-oriented to a timed labor model. The Soviet government, attempting to raise industrial production in competition with the capitalist West, aimed to convince their workers that time was a finite resource to be guarded and rigidly distributed. This was especially difficult with former peasants, who were used to the feudal model and often showed up to their factory jobs late or not at all. At base, the reformation of temporality in the Soviet Union relied on disabusing the proletariat from the belief that they had a wealth of time. It was fundamentally an ideological issue. Leon Trotsky described this feudal orientation to time, writing that peasants believed, quote, "Whatever time or space is, we probably have enough of it." In industrial society, time was no longer spacious, but was instead a finite reserve, not the material of life, but the medium of labor. Subsequently, the task for the Soviet government, and really any establishment hoping to boost industrial product, was to economize time. Thompson, discussing the ideological transition to an economized time, writes, quote, "Those who are employed experience a distinction between their employer's time and their own time. And the employer must use the time of his labor and see it not wasted. Not the task, but the value of time when reduced to money is dominant. Time is now currency. It is not past, but spent." This idea of time as currency, time as not the substance of life, but the substance of work, is the essential link between the modern and contemporary modes of temporality. Workers initially reacted to this imposition to economize time with simple resistance, skipping work, showing up late, or idling on the job. However, without bargaining power and faced with a labor surplus, the workers were forced to accept the employer's terms. Later, workers would strike for the 10-hour movement, overtime, and the 5-day work week. Essentially, this process of bargaining down working time to a livable amount was a process of accepting the employer's conceit that labor should be compensated based on time and not on task. The process of inculcating time thrift into the working population, however, did not end with the simple equation of time to money. Once time has been accepted to equal money, employers feel entitled not to just what the worker naturally produces in a set amount of time, but the maximum that could be squeezed from that period of work. In other words, once the employers can, without argument, have ownership of a set amount of time, the ever-hungry capitalist machine increasingly requires more profits. Factory owners increasingly stress productivity and efficiency, using Taylorist methods to extract further effort. Taylorist systems inherently require increased observation, with upper-level management acting as timekeepers to enforce the highest possible level of productivity. Furthermore, the focus on minimizing movements to the essentials meant that workers' bodies were engineered like cogs in a machine, insisting on minute control and a limit of any human excess. As Soviet philosopher Alexander Bogdanov observed, this meant that workers' senses would be dulled through repetition, further divorcing them from the actuality of their product and thus the sense of their labor. Thus, the process of teaching laborers time thrift was one of enforcing punctuality, increasing productivity, and exacting control. The process of inculcating time thrift did not just exist in factories. Globally, the modern era witnessed a process of spatial and temporal compression. The rise of train tracks, telegraph lines, longitude surveys, and the establishment of global standard time were all contributing to a process of intellectual, industrial, and national conquest. The even regulation of time in particular made economic intervention across the globe much easier. The compression of time in the modern era was further contributed to by the heightened tempo of life and nervous stimulation of the city. Time was felt as a weight, a temporal demand that was ever more palpable. In his 1903 essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, Georg Simmel describes the experience of modernity as being an oppressively accelerating tempo of modern life that results in the growth of a protective organ, an extreme rationality that relies on a reduction of all human relationships to economic value. Thus, time thrift is something that must be both outwardly mandated by the employer and internalized by the worker. In contemporary culture, time thrift continues to be a point of friction. However, the equation of time and money is so deeply ingrained in our, particularly American culture, that it is difficult to step outside. On the employer side, corporations lament the popularity of quiet quitting, essentially a term created to disparage workers who are not maximally efficient. The term takes as its basis the assumption that anything less than maximum output is an infringement on the terms of work. Amongst workers, hustle influencers encourage viewers to monetize hobbies, insisting that anything you devote yourself to that does not make money is a fundamental misuse of time. In this way, the contemporary era runs close to the modern experience of time as opposed to the feudal one. Work is not based on a set of tasks, but instead on a commitment of time. And in a society where many fear that they are downwardly mobile, that time commitment can never quite feel like enough. This feeling of an ever-increasing time crunch is only exacerbated by quickened consumer cycles, with products becoming obsolete in rapid succession. Zygmunt Bauman, writing on the relationship between modernity and time, writes, "Modernity starts when space and time are separated from living practice and from each other. Time has been so cleanly separated from living practice that the average person now feels a vague call to productivity at all hours of the day, and a corresponding sense of time wasted, regardless of the necessity, urgency, or relevance of the work. In an economy that increasingly relies on financialization, that productivity is ever further divorced from anything we might recognize as logically necessary. This process of abstraction removes us ever further from a relationship to time that feels agentive, where we can make sense of ourselves as social and economic actors. It is this question of agency that brings us to the fundamental alliance between feudal and contemporary temporalities, a lack of orientation. The long static present of the feudal and contemporary models is in direct opposition to the always subsumed present of the modern era. Fundamentally, this difference arises from the modern notion of the future as the site of becoming. The feudal model is characterized by repeatable, cyclical history that was directed and mandated by God. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers reconceptualized history as a social, economic, and political progression directed by human forces. While the method of progression could vary widely, the modernist project takes the identification and shaping of that method as its central principle. Thus, the ruptures and discontinuities of capitalism, industrialism, and urbanization were understood as the necessary conditions to advance in history. This modern model of progress, founded as it is on an always deficient past and a future in progress, meant that the present moment was always being consigned to the past as obsolete. Peter Osborne describes this modern present as, quote, not so much a gap in time as a gap of time, a moment always on the cusp of being brushed away. Tim Armstrong, reflecting on this future orientation, writes, "This shift to the future revolutionized the cultural temporal order and restructured its commitment from the old to the new, from the known to the unknown. The focus on the future and its corresponding investment in change encourages revolutionary thinking, advocacy for political change, and a fundamental belief that economic, social, and political structures could be modified. George Gurvich argues that a historical conception of time is essential for societies to become aware both of their present circumstances and their ability to fundamentally alter those conditions. The modern era, with its clear conception of progressing historical periods oriented towards an as yet incomplete future, is uniquely suited towards one's awareness of agency as a historical actor." The stasis that characterizes both the feudal and contemporary moments is situated upon this above all else, a sense of the historical situation as unalterable or even preordained. As Elida Osman argues, Western society has largely seen itself disenchanted with the future since the 1980s. Osman goes on to write, "We no longer rely on the future, we tend to it anxiously." This cultural observation aligns neatly with Wolfgang Streeck's analysis of the economy, in which he marks the late 1970s as a period of global inflation resulting from productive capital investment falling short of rising wages and standards of living. Since the 1980s, society has become increasingly indebted, with individuals taking out credit card loans, mortgages, and student loans to uphold a standard of living that used to be supported by higher wages and more robust social services. While the masses see lower and lower standards of living, the wealthiest parts of society continue to become richer. What's more, this model seems unlikely to change at any time in the near future, with the government continually investing in maintaining upper-class wealth rather than enforcing worker protections or putting social safety nets into place. This perhaps contributes to what Zygmunt Bauman and Fuchs and Francois Hartog all identify as the long present of the contemporary moment. In the absence of any singular narrative of the past and any direction towards the future, the present is always just more of the same. Both the feudal and contemporary periods conceptualize the future as, at best, static, and at worst, the site of eschatological disaster. The modern period's grand model of history was preceded by the feudal model's lowercase histories, essentially a multitude of stories from which one could learn. Because the present was understood as nothing fundamentally new, one could issue prognoses based on human action as a static category. The present, past, and future thus blended into one long moment, inherently static, predictable, and cyclical. Given that this chronology was preordained by God, the apocalypse was always on the feudal timeline, marking its inevitable end. The contemporary period is surprisingly linked to the feudal model along the line of eschatological thinking. The negative economic estimations of our time take on an eschatological lean when we consider the threat of ecological disaster. Historian Anne Fuchs writes that the future is no longer a horizon for ideological planning, but instead the projection screen for dystopian visions of the final ecological catastrophe. Seeing the threats and effects of this climate disaster every day, it is more and more difficult to picture a future that does not result in mass suffering. Furthermore, for many, it is likely easier to indulge in eschatological thinking when we do not see any historical alternatives. In a system that sees increased economic inequality and continuous government blocks to intervention, many identify the apocalypse as the most tenable site of change, a sort of accelerationism. However, it's important to distinguish between the feudal and contemporary models of apocalypse here. At least the feudal visualization of hellfire to come serves as a reckoning. In the contemporary model, it is those most at fault who are the most likely to see salvation. Naturally, none of the three models has an unburdened relationship to temporality, predicated as they are on extractive processes. Whether that be the feudal acceptance that the world is directed by forces larger than humanity, or the capitalist reduction of time to a currency, what is most compelling is that, as natural as it seems, no relationship to time is inherent. Conceptions of temporality shift in various eras, perhaps most significantly in relation to larger feelings of agency produced by our conceptions of ourselves as historical actors. So, when we speak of contemporary temporality as going nowhere fast, it is with the knowledge that this conception is historically situated and, much like our current conditions, in no way preordained. Thank you.
Check, check.
Let me see.
All right, thank you so much to all our panelists. So we're gonna have about 30 minutes of Q&A now. Anyone in the audience can ask a question. We'll also possibly have questions from Zoom. So yeah, let's start with the audience. Does anyone have a question for? Yeah. Maybe we can pass the other mic around. Where's the other mic? I can just pass this one on. It's fine.
Hi. So I guess I have a question for, or a kind of thought or a question for all the panelists, and then maybe something specific for each one. But it's really about how each of you are thinking about periodizing the present as being fundamentally different or not from whatever era we would want to call the era that began roughly in the 1970s, 1980s, whether it's neoliberalism, whether it's the post-modernity, post-industrial, and your sense or not of whether or not something, fundamentally has changed, very recently, maybe the last 10 years, last 2 years. So for the first paper, I was struck by your attempt to kind of think through the reification of nature and green finance, but also still evoking the concept of fictitious capital. So when I think of fictitious capital, I think of that as being a very term to understand, the financialization of the 1980s, 1990s, but green finance perhaps is something new, or not. And then for the second paper, the index fund since the 70s, that sounds right to me, but I was curious how the kind of recent rise of private equity, even private credit, or the increasing decrease in public companies, such that when you're buying an index, you're essentially buying 7, large publicly traded companies. If that in the last 10 years, creates a fundamentally different dynamic than the kind of index world would. And then the last paper, I was really struck by the modern versus contemporary, as opposed to a modern, postmodern kind of framing. And so when is the contemporary begin in the 1980s? And are we still kind of in that moment? Or do you see, with respect to temporality, anything new in the, the very recent past?
I guess I could start. So I suppose I see the rise of private equity and private credit as being caused by the index fund, actually, because, before index funds were big, you would have all of these corporate raiders who would go and buy out stocks of a publicly traded company back when the public markets were a lot less decentralized than they are now. And that would be a way of, like, these people did this. They took companies private and changed the management and, cut costs and stripped off all the assets and sold them off. I think that's largely now happening in private markets because takeovers aren't really possible in public markets anymore, just because you have such big institutional shareholders. And there's not, in a sense, taking over some company and then getting it to compete more aggressively with other companies is defecting from the index fund arrangement where everyone's just not competing with each other as aggressively. So I see the rise of private equity and private credit as sort of a second order effect of the rise of index funds. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. So I guess as a cultural historian, I think of a very stark divide, probably in the late 60s with the transition to postmodernism in art. And so I guess primarily I study the modern era. So most of that early period I think of kind of as a destruction of sort of universalizing principles, or sort of a turning against or unpacking sort of the negative aspects of modernism and sort of the negative aspects of a kind of a universalizing Enlightenment plan. But I would say now that we're sort of sufficiently deconstructed to the point where it's sort of about thinking about future alternatives, potentially a return to sort of a modernist progress, or whatever somebody else could conceptualize.
Thank you for your question. I'm afraid I would not have a year as the point of transition, but I would say in the way I'm thinking about green finance, there's a continuation of earlier forms of financial formulations like fictitious capital. There's a unification of industrial and finance capital to a greater degree. What's new or what's transformative is this interest in theorizing futurity with the use of modeling and new forms of commodifications that come with it, especially the ecosystem services framework, which is a very, very recent framework. It was conceptualized in the early 2000s through these reports. So I see it as a continuation with difference rather than a radical departure. Yeah.
So I think there was a question in the back over here, and then I saw another question here, and then one there, and then one there. So we'll go in that order.
I just have one question about the second paper, Paul's paper. It was very generative. I found it really interesting. I want to focus in on the idea of these index funds as a kind of infra-government, kind of private form of government. And I wonder if you have anything to say about the relationship between that and an older form of private government, that's to say insurance. I mean, that exercises a huge control over the way firms operate. And you might say there's a kind of universal insurer in the form of reinsurance, a kind of global reinsurer. So I'm wondering if you just have anything to say about the relationship between these two forms of, as it were, kind of private government.
Right. I mean, I think they're very closely connected just because a lot of the biggest sources of funding for the asset managers are reinsurance clients. So I think there's a big continuity there. I mean, even going further back from your question, I think conceptualizing the earliest joint stock companies like, the East India companies, for instance, and the large American shipping and railroad companies that developed in the 19th century. Those all had governmental aspects of them too. So, I mean, perhaps it's not, I mean, there's always been continuities between state political power and economic power, and in different periods that's institutionalized in different ways, I think. So, yeah, I'm very, I appreciate the suggestion of like looking at the insurance case as well. Thanks.
All right, we have one over here.
Great, thanks. Thanks for three really thought-provoking papers. I really was, well, stimulated by them. I have two requests for clarifications and then just a comment on the third one. So Ashima, I was really happy that you are kind of trying to theorize climate issues in terms of imperialism and income deflation and all those important things, I think, very correctly. I was not able to quite follow your argument completely, hence my request for clarification, because some of the tables were very tiny print and I can't read them from here. So really my question is exactly how do you see the mechanisms of green finance specifically? That is to say, loans that are given on whatever for allegedly green purposes. How exactly do these function in that larger environment in which you laid out? So that's my question for you. And sorry, if I may just put all my three questions. And then my question for Paul is, I guess two quick clarifications. Number one, how do you see the history of the transition of these asset funds from holding primarily financial assets to increasingly holding real assets? When did they happen? Why do you think they happened? I mean, I have an idea of an answer, but I would like to know what you have found. And there was one other thing. Oh, well, anyway, I've forgotten. And then I just want to say that in terms of the time horizon, how we view the future, I mean, I wonder if you wouldn't think that the, neoliberalism has gone along with a complete erasure of socialism as the horizon of humanity's future. So what does that have to do with the way in which we today envisage a future, which is not only kind of absent, or almost the future is absent, but it's really dystopian. It's really a source of anxiety, whether it is nuclear war, climate change, or simply our awful economic system. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think socialism as sort of a future alternative, I think, is definitely a very valid sort of social horizon for people. I think when I'm speaking about sort of contemporary experiences of time, it's because, of course, we live under such a forceful economic system, and because that economic system doesn't really allow for the picturing of other modes, that sort of feeling of futurelessness or helplessness can come about. But again, as I think of it, it's very much something that's culturally situated, historically situated, very much changeable. So I definitely think some sort of further engagement with socialism, sort of maybe more political action, things like that would make that sort of future kind of return into consciousness.
This is a great question. I think it started in the Great Depression because before all of these interests started buying the real assets directly. They were lending on the real assets. So they owned the debt that was attached to real estate. And that started when the government basically bailed out the entire real estate industry in the 1930s. Or, the Great Depression, even when I think it accelerated in the Great Recession. In the Great Depression, when the government set up the modern mortgage finance system, that packaged the debt on real estate in a way that institutional owners started buying. But then since the 1970s, as interest rates have gradually decreased and gone all the way to zero or to negative since the Great Recession, that's when it's been more attractive for institutional owners to own the assets directly rather than just the debt, because the debt on the assets doesn't pay anything in the post global financial crisis setting until recently in the last year or two. But we'll see where things go from there.
Thank you for your question. So if I understand it correctly, the clarification is on how green finance sort of operates in the larger imperialism argument. I think part of the confusion is because I have not presented like other sections from the chapter where I get into it. In this presentation, my attempt was to sort of unpack the abstract conceptual activity of green finance. And what I mean by that is the way in which green finance posits itself as a solution to capital. And there I highlight the concept of reification. Now coming to the question of the historical, in the later part of my chapter, I unpack how a lot of these loans have been directed towards Adani Greens, one of the major mega corporations, not only in India, but now in the world. It's the biggest renewable energy corporation in the world right now, and went through a really infamous financial scandal in the last year. So the next chapter, the continuation of the chapter really unpacks that, how the loans are directed towards an even greater concentration of capital. Paralleling that is emergence of another category called green work and green factory work. So that's where the contradiction sort of pronounces itself most starkly, that you have these older, there's really no transformation in the factory structure itself. It really is a function of formal categorization of work as green, even though the conditions and relations of production remain intact. So that's how I'm kind of trying to trace the conceptual and the historical together. Thank you.
Okay, I think Catherine was next, and then we'll go over here.
Thank you for 3 great papers. I have a general question for all of you and then a more specific question for Hannah. Are you familiar with the book that came out last year called Climate Change as Class War by Matt Huber? Verse number 1. I think it would be interesting to think about green capitalism in terms of what Huber sets out as class war, which he traces back to the separation of the worker from the land and the productivity of the land. He does this Marxist historiography of the separation of man from human beings from nature. But then my more specific question to Hannah is, I totally accept and think that your sketch of temporality, feudal and contemporary and capitalist to be a very excellent. But I'm wondering if you've thought about the chapter in Marx Capital, Volume 1, on the working day, where he talks about the fact that in the first industrial revolution, because of the explosive productivity of the machine, the factory owners really wanted to keep the workers out, the factories open 24 hours. So this is where the vampirism comes in. They did not want the machines to rest because of the productivity of the profit. So I'm wondering if you could put that in relationship to what you alluded to as this kind of hustle culture that is part of the downwardly mobile worker and her position today. And getting back to Radhika's comment, I just want to comment on one thing. Xi Jinping said that 2050, China will achieve full socialism. And one of the ways they're doing it is through the 996, 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, 9 to 9, 6 days a week. And it's, literally burning people out, but it's mostly for white collar workers at this point. Anyway, so there is a horizon. And it does include 1.4 billion people. He also said that they should plant 13 million trees in Beijing, and it happened. So there is a central planning future on the other side of the globe. Sorry.
Oh, thank you so much for that comment. It's been a while since I read the working day section. But I think what's interesting about that is this idea that when you're first transitioning to factory work, it's not just about convincing people to sort of submit to the logic of the factory, but to submit sort of the external time imposition of the factory. And so that idea that, you could sort of take a maximum of time from the workers or sort of purchase them sort of as sort of kind of terminally was sort of what people were, of course, bargaining for with unions throughout the year, sort of getting that time horizon down. And so what I think is so interesting about the time period is that beginning of factory labor is about getting people to internalize timed labor, getting people to feel that time equals money. And it was that work that was so fundamentally difficult. And now so I'd say kind of not the reverse is true, but that feeling of timed labor as being kind of, or time equaling money is so central that you don't have to convince people of that. So like the idea of the hustle culture is that people will kind of impose that upon themselves or keep that work going up all the time. And I guess really what the distinction is in a factory setting, you can strictly see, here's the boss, they are the person that is asking me to devote all of my time. While in sort of hustle culture, you can sort of picture yourself as being your own boss. And so there's this sense that you can kind of take control of capitalism that way. Right, exactly, yeah. And so you're participating in the system wholeheartedly, but you're sort of doing it with this sort of ideological twist that you're in control of it. So I think that is kind of an interesting distinction. Thank you.
One area of the hustle culture I've actually encountered for my research on land is landlord TikTok, which is an insane corner of TikTok to explore. But I mean, you have people everywhere from professionals who operate like big factories and warehouses down to slumlords and everything. But they very much talk about time as an asset, their time as an asset, but also appropriating the time of their tenants as an asset. The tenants are going to work every day and paying the rent, and that's coming to the landlords as it's essentially the landlord is creating more time from the tenant's time, is how I think it's often expressed. Yeah.
Thank you for the suggestion on the reading climate changes class 4. Yeah, I think class is a very important unit of analysis in this, especially for my paper, but I guess for all of us. Within my project, I see the question of class emerging, as I was talking earlier, in the idea of green work. So now you have proletarization of a new form articulated through green work. Workers are being trained. There are literally classes, like there are small workshops of workers where they get training in like how to fix a solar power panel, at what times the panel needs to be tilted. And this is the kind, so you have a parallel, right? You have a formulation of green work, but also resurgence of like a working day type of control mechanism. Where there's a complete dissociation between the mental and the intellectual. So thank you. Yeah.
I think you were first.
First of all, thank you so much for 3 awesome presentations. Very stimulating. My question is specifically for Paul, although anyone is welcome to jump in. I found particularly provocative your kind of engagement with this idea of universal ownership, and particularly the idea that, as I understood your argument, universal ownership results in this kind of functional incentive to manage the overall risk of the financial system. And so in the example you cited, right, it's BlackRock forcing Exxon to conform to environmental standards in the face of environmental risk. And the reason I found that provocative is that in my perception of the kind of current financial system, systemic risk has never been higher. And what a defining feature to me of ESG, for instance, is precisely its inadequacy in the face of ecological catastrophe, and that, the required investment to avert a real crisis that will, definitively impact future returns is not being invested. So I wonder how you're thinking about that, and specifically about how this tendency towards universal ownership and the systemic reduction of risk does or doesn't actually result in the decrease of that risk.
Yeah, thanks. I think I largely agree with that thought, actually. I think we're still in the early days of universal ownership, as like the index funds have only recently gotten big enough where they can have an influence in managing the systemic risk, really only since the global financial crisis. And you saw institutions like BlackRock and others helping the Treasury manage risk in the global financial crisis. And I think part of the explanation for why they're not doing more is a lot of saber rattling by people on the right in the US, threatening to regulate the asset managers or to take away their power to aggregate the voting blocks of all the shares that they manage. That's been a proposal that's been seriously floated in the Senate recently. You even had someone run for president on an anti-asset manager platform. So I think they are trying to do this management of systemic risk, but under a lot of constraints. And I mean, I largely agree with the thought about ESG as crowding out more serious attempts to make serious progress on climate change. I think that's it's used by a lot of people as just smoke and mirrors to distract from what really needs to be done, which is serious government regulation. Because the state, even though it's been weakened by decades of neoliberalism, still is much more powerful than the asset managers and still has a much wider ability to control economic activity.
So thank you, everybody, for an exciting panel. My question is for Hannah. So I'm coming from medieval studies, so it's going to be a question that looks a little bit backward. So I was curious to know what are your sources to define feudal temporality? So if you've been working with primary sources, secondary sources, and which one? And second, if you're familiar with the work by Jacques Le Goff, who's an historian of the Middle Ages, and he worked on labor and time at the end of the Middle Ages. I think the collection of works is called Time and Work, or Time and Labor, translated into English from French. And actually, he argues that there's a difference between church time and merchant time. And so that the time of the bell were regulating the agrarian labor of peasants in the Middle Ages. So it was a much more seasonal, flexible idea of time. And then with the rise of the market, you get a more kind of financial, segmented, fragmented, monetized idea of time. So I was wondering if you engage with that in your work, if you're familiar with this kind of contributions, or if not, I think it would resonate a lot with what you're doing, basically.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Actually, I'm very much a modernist. I study photography. So most of the time when I'm looking at sort of references towards feudalism, it's very much as sort of like what came before as opposed to looking at it directly. So when I engage with primary sources, it's mostly Soviet authors. So I have very little in the way of feudal direct engagement. So that source will be very helpful. And yeah, I absolutely agree about the distinction between sort of the introduction of sort of rudimentary clocks or like sort of bells as timekeeping and sort of the rise of a modern kind of industrial timekeeping. And that idea of acceleration, I think, is really what corresponds to that idea of an industrial time as opposed to a sort of more cyclical feudal time. And so that sounds like it'll be very helpful. Thank you.
All right. There's a debate on this, but you can say something.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, so time for probably one, maybe two questions. Okay. Yeah, maybe we'll collect them. So I saw 3 hands. Start over here.
Thanks very much. Paul, thanks for your paper. This is a question for you. I wanted to ask about 2 communities you didn't discuss in your presentation, though. One of them you addressed with John's answer, the whole private fund side of things, which I can tell if you're giving them a pass. I think many people would think they're a little bit more rapacious than index funds. They do a lot more hiring and firing of employees. Their principals tend to be on the boards of institutions like the University of Chicago. Not quite the same for index advisors.
And Yale University.
All of them. Yeah, all of them. And then but the other community was us. the money in index funds is ours. That's individual retirement savings. So are we complicit? Are we ignorant? Are we experiencing false consciousness? They are, I think, trying to pass through the votes to individual investors. Do you think that's a real initiative, or is that window dressing?
All right, so we'll collect the questions.
Yes, thank you. Congratulations for your presentation. Hannah, what about the home office? Home office after COVID? Home office. Because you think that the people is working in the factory or in their office, but not anymore. I mean, the young people works at home. So what happened with the time? Okay. And also the same question for the other panelists. COVID change anything or no? Because you didn't mention COVID. Oh, what happened? 2 years. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so thank you all. Question for Ashima about sort of economic categories. Does green energy make profits, and is it really commodifying nature? Or is it a new enclosure making monopolized assets for which they can charge a fee or a rent for us to access? So Polanyi famously says land, labor, and money, fictitious commodities. They can be commodified, but not completely. I think a Marxian could accommodate that, but I'm curious what you think. And also one for Hannah. Maybe your thoughts on temporality and speculation. Keynes famously said that money is a link between the past and the future, but it also separates the past from the future and, the expectation of the investor. I was just curious if you had thoughts on that, but I'll give you a pass because if you don't, because your talk was mostly about labor, but thank you all.
All right, so we're running up on time, so just be brief if you can.
Unfortunately, we are complicit both in our retirement accounts, and endowments fund a lot of our salaries, and endowments are invested in private funds and public funds. I think a lot of us earn both labor income and capital income, and to that extent, people are complicit. Just a thought about this last question too. A new frontier is what's called natural asset companies, where people are buying up, or institutions are buying up portions of nature that produce the most ecosystem services with the thought that they will be enclosed and monetized in the future. So that's sort of, I think, one of the next frontiers of asset manager capitalism.
Thank you for your question. It's something that I'm also trying to work through because it's a very difficult question to answer, right? There are, in a way, both temporalities of commodification working. So you have fictitious commodification, but you also have rentier relationships, specifically when one thinks about ecosystem services in terms of service providers and beneficiaries, right? But who is the service provider here? If it's the relationship between a third world country and a corporation, then one sees further hierarchy of relationships. You would have people maintaining the natural asset, maintaining the forest, which has now become a provisional services of nature. And they would have a wage labor relationship to the whole profiling. So yeah, I would say that there is a layering of different kinds of commodification and economic relationships. But thank you so much for that question.
Yeah, I do definitely focus more on labor and labor history. But I am interested, I guess, in the idea of temporality, or the idea of money as being speculative towards the future, insofar as it sort of pervades popular consciousness for sort of possibilities for the future, or sort of kind of a general turn for hopefulness. And I think at least most people I know are more kind of weighed down by debt than they are by sort of speculative future income. So I guess I sort of turn towards that kind of idea of hopelessness as linked to debt, as opposed to future ideals connection to speculation.
Okay, thank you so much, Jake, for moderating. Thank you, our panelists. And we'll have a 10-minute pause. We'll reconvene at 11-ish for our second panel on land, grant, and financialization. We still have a lot of coffee and pastries.